Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today we'll be covering Mpox in Southeast Asia, Thailand's handout scheme, and a chip deal between Singapore and India.
We'll also discuss the Kanlaon volcano in the Philippines. I'm Japhet and Lauren.
And I'm Lauren Mai. Today is September 19th, 2024. As many of you know, the situation in Myanmar remains unsteady. Ethnic armed organizations are making ground against an increasingly weak junta. But what does this mean for the country moving forward? To find answers, Greg, Myint, and Andreyka Natalegawa discuss the latest developments. Before that, let's start with our headlines. At the top of our headlines today are fears of a potential volcanic eruption in the Philippines.
That's right. On September 11th, hundreds of people fled their homes as the Kanlaon volcano spurted toxic gases, the highest emission from the volcano since instrumental gas monitoring first started.
The Philippines has currently placed the region on Alert Level 2, which creates a 4-kilometer radius permanent danger zone around the volcano, as well as prohibiting flying any aircrafts around the area. Evacuees are taking temporary shelter at schools and community centers.
While bracing for eruption, Field Office Western Visayas has about $2.6 million worth of support resources ready, with around 38,000 family food packs and 15,000 non-food items standing by.
With the volcano erupting 15 times over the past 9 years, we are wishing the Philippines all the best during this time. Our next story covers the region's response to the spread of Mpox in Southeast Asia.
Right. Formerly known as monkeypox, the viral disease has been detected in Thailand and the Philippines after the World Health Organization declared a global emergency mid-August.
The latest variant of concern is called Clade 1b, which is considered deadlier and more susceptible to children than the original strain Clade 2, which caused a global concern in 2022.
Asia's first known case of Clade 1b was detected in a foreigner who flew into Thailand on August 14th. Thailand has since taken the measures to contact trace other people on the same flight. Meanwhile, the case in the Philippines was of the original variety, Clade 2, with the Philippines warning the public to follow health and hygiene protocols implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic.
While the World Health Organization has emphasized that Mpox is not the new COVID, Southeast Asia is currently taking preemptive measures to prevent future outbreaks. From what I've gathered during this time, the trend across the region is not treating the disease as strongly as COVID-19, but still implementing strict health screening measures and hygiene protocols.
That's correct. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore are currently enforcing health screening measures at their respective state entry points, monitoring possible cases closely.
Vietnam is doing something somewhat similar, monitoring any suspected cases at their borders while issuing guidelines on how to prevent, track, trace, and treat the disease to local governments.
But what's of most concern is the stigma behind the disease, which may deter people from seeking diagnosis and treatment.
Oh, absolutely. Healthcare specialists are urging public officials across the region to engage with the community to properly educate their citizens and ensure that their advice is followed.
Proper education is definitely the right way forward on this. Let's move on to our next story. Thailand will deploy its $4.35 million digital wallet handout program sooner than expected.
And why is that?
The Deputy Finance Minister emphasized the importance of creating a short-term economic stimulus. With weaker than expected exports and public investment, Thailand's GDP forecast remains stagnant.
Got it. That makes sense to me. You'd hope that these measures might do the trick to jumpstart the Thai economy.
Maybe. Critics are skeptical, though. There were 2 central bank governors who insist that the plan is fiscally irresponsible.
But wasn't this plan under Sata before he got removed?
Yes. The 10,000 baht, or around $280 stimulus, was supposed to go out in May to some 50 million people.
Right. And then it kept getting delayed because people in the government disagreed on how the stimulus should be paid for.
Under new Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra, part of this handout will be in cash. 32 million people registered for the program so far.
Let's see if this local spending kicks the economy back into shape.
Only time will tell. Okay, for our last story, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi paid a visit to Singapore last week, looking for common ground on semiconductors and digital technologies with Singaporean Prime Minister Lawrence Wong.
And they managed to make some good deals, too.
No, really? Like what?
They signed 4 MOUs meant to deepen cooperation between the 2 countries in critical sectors like semiconductors, digital technology, skills development, and healthcare.
Sounds like a good idea to me. Singapore is India's largest foreign investor after all.
Right. It was a good day for chip production. Singapore promised to support India's burgeoning semiconductor industry, while meanwhile, India will facilitate the entry of Singaporean companies and bolster supply chains within its market.
With the chips war ever intensifying throughout the region, this was much needed.
Exactly. India is very aware of the importance of cooperation on these critical technologies and has been strengthening its relationship with Singapore under its Act East policy, aiming to bolster ties with Indo-Pacific countries.
Great to hear it. Wishing them well in their cooperative endeavors.
And that wraps up our headlines for today. If we missed anything that you wanted to hear about, do write us at scaradio@csis.org and we'll get back to you.
Up next, Greg's conversation with Jack Myint and Andreyka Natalegawa. Stay tuned.
Welcome back, folks. As always, I'm Greg Poling here at CSIS. Alina is off again today in the region, and we couldn't make schedules align, so we are joined by Andreyka Natalegawa, back after only one episode as our standing co-host. Hey, Andreyka, thanks for joining.
Hi, Greg. Hello, everyone.
And today's special guest is a longtime friend, Jack Myint, who also is a non-resident fellow with our Southeast Asia program here. Hey, Jack.
Greg, it's great to see you, and thanks for having me on the show.
No, it's a real pleasure. Jack is here to talk about the latest on Myanmar. It's been a few months since we've talked about the war in Myanmar. And to catch folks up, we continue to see gains on the battlefield by various resistance forces, particularly the members of the Three Brotherhood Alliance, Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, or the KOCAN, the Taang National Liberation Army, and the Arakan Army. Those are the three who launched what was called Operation 1027, standing for October 27th, late last year, and had just stunning victories, particularly in northern Shan State. They relaunched the second version, Operation 1027 Part 2, earlier this summer, and have made battlefield gains, the most spectacular being last month's the fall of Lasho in Shan State. But as recently as last week, we saw reports of the TNLA taking new towns, Arakan Army taking a Myanmar Navy base. We've also seen smaller, but I think significant gains by the Kachin Independence Army, as well as by some of the PDFs. At least from here, it seems that the intensity of fighting, particularly in Mandalay, by the Mandalay-based PDFs, has gotten intense, which must really be bringing the fight home for a lot of Myanmar in the cities, for whom this was probably still a bit distant for a while. But the idea that you could have resistance forces threatening Myanmar's second city in Mandalay would have been unthinkable. And on top of all that, of course, we have the political jockeying by the various factions, economic turmoil, a lot to talk about. But Jack, let me give you the open-ended question there about the resistance getting so close to Mandalay. Do you think that we have entered a real new phase of the war this year, whether that started with 1027 and this is just continuing, or more recently, if things have really shifted?
Thank you, Greg. Before I jump into it, if you'll indulge me just for a minute, I'd like to do a bit of a public service announcement here and bring folks' attention to the humanitarian crisis and flooding caused by Typhoon Yogi to my fellow Myanmar citizens. Regardless of the politics or the situation of the war, this is a humanitarian, and I urge all listeners and our friends here in Washington and beyond to help in any way that they can address this situation.
A good point, Jack. Thank you. Our producer and research associate with South Asia, Japhet, inked our latest update for the South Asian newsletter day, focused on the destruction, which the news has mainly paid attention to northern Vietnam and to a degree the Philippines. But as you point out, the remnants of the typhoon have continued to cause flooding and landslides in northern Thailand, southern Laos, and northeast Myanmar, particularly Shan State. And so this didn't just cause a tragedy in Vietnam, it's caused a tragedy across the region.
Certainly. And with that opening, if I may jump into the question that you raised on the state of the Civil War, I think it is fair to say with the second version of Operation 1027, which saw the first ever, really, in Myanmar military's history, the fall of an entire regional command, right? The Northeast Regional Command. It is certainly significant and unprecedented. There's no doubt that the military is facing severe losses and facing pressure both externally and internally. You may have also read rumors circulating about a potential internal palace coup, which was very quickly refuted, but nonetheless, the sentiment within the Myanmar military, based on our assessments and those of experts on the field, is that it is shaky at best. The victory in question is really attributable to, as you rightfully pointed out, the Three Brotherhood Alliance. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't also include the United Wa State Army, UWSA's involvement in this, both in an active involvement or a passive involvement in the form of provision of arms. They are, after all, the biggest military ethnic armed group in the country, which has weapons production capability, as well as, to some degree, anti-aircraft artillery. So, it's the Three Brotherhood Alliance and the UWSA, with the Three Brotherhood Alliance drawing the clear line of offense with the junta, and the junta, in reciprocity, declaring them all as terrorist organizations, right, as a result of 1027, which also saw the fall of Lasho, a major city. In dissecting that, I think it is very important. If there's one key takeaway that we need to bring from this, and very important to emphasize the fact that we cannot and we must not generalize this development. As I'm starting to see a lot of some of our fellow think tanks or even academics around town celebrating this as a resistance win, which is a very general term and has so many nuances and caveats that it should not be easily described as a black or white matter. The premise of the question is every military loss equivalent to resistance. The answer is not always so simple, right? So let's look at, okay, even if it is, let's dissect what constitutes resistance, right? Is everyone that are against the military considered resistance? And when we say resistance, then comes the question of, is it pro-democracy resistance? Is this, authoritarian resistance? What issues, values align them or not align them? Because it's not one lump that can be categorized under one heading. That's a very important distinction that needs to be made. In that regard, the Three Brotherhood Alliance, while on paper aligned with the pro-democracy forces and do work in tandem with the local People's Defense Forces, some of whom have pledged their allegiance to the civilian national unity government, it doesn't always mean that the pro-democracy elements of the resistance are driving the train here. There are factors of influence to take into account. There are the flow of funds and political capital and, of course, arms that are involved in this game. And when you look at that, I think there is no secret where the allegiance of the likes of UWSA is most aligned with, right? And in that regard, if UWSA is in fact the big player, as we have all seen, and the provider of these arms, they also have the mandate and influence on how those arms get utilized. And for as long as it aligns with their interest, right? For as long as they don't object, sure. But to what degree and when they can or may step in, well, we'll have to wait and see. So it's not as simple. It's not as clear.
Jack, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, for the military and the junta, what's their next move? In the sense that they're facing a fight on multiple fronts. They're attempting to govern what little territory they still hold. What's their end game here?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, Andreyka. And I think there is realization inside the military leadership, which really at this point has come down to one individual, that things are not going so well for them. And so there needs to be active search for a way out, or as some folks put it, a face-saving exit, right? That still protects their interest to some degree, that doesn't end with them in custody or worse. So there is an active front there. And I think based on study of their announcements, public or otherwise, and their foreign engagement strategy, all arrows, all roads are pointing to one thing and one thing only. That's elections. They want to use elections as a way to establish a saving out. It's never with the military in Myanmar. What you need to understand is that if they feel that their hand is forced, if they feel that they are driven into submission to make a decision, they will double down. And the likelihood of burning the whole thing down increases. The same way that we saw the transition happen in 2011, it happened on their terms. And I'm not saying that's the right approach. I'm saying that's how they think. So I think what's going to happen is they would want to come off as, well, we are organizing these elections and under our terms provide a way for the next step forward back to quote unquote elected civilian-led democracy, right? Which there are so many questions about that and the viability of elections at a time when the nation is in open conflict, the credibility of the electoral process, right? The list goes on. But for now, the way that they have positioned it is elections. Now, I mentioned foreign relations, so I'll jump into that. So the recent visit of the Chinese foreign minister is very telling, right? And the individuals that he engaged with, from the senior general and the current junta chief, his foreign minister, but then interestingly, also the previous senior general, right? The retired former SPDC junta chief, who has been in retirement. So a consultation with them all that signals that, and based on what we've heard of the internal workings within those meetings, was seeking China's help and support in delivering this election.
Let's talk about all the neighbors, because one of the things that seems most surprising, particularly in the wake of Operation 1027 and these unprecedented losses by the military, has been what seems to be kind of a scrambling by China, as well as I think India and Thailand, to try to figure out who they're supposed to back. I mean, all three of these countries had, I think, assumed on day one after the coup in 2021 that the junta would inevitably win, right? Because they assume that the military always wins. The military always ends up establishing control, at least over the heartland in Myanmar. And the writing is on the wall. That's not happening. The military hasn't won a significant battlefield victory since 1027. I mean, probably in the last 2 years, even in the case of Miyawadi in Karen State. Yeah, they managed to get the Karen border guard to take the town, but then the Tatmadaw own forces couldn't get through, spending weeks and weeks on the road bogged down. Morale's horrendous. They control, 35% of the country on their best day. And all I see is tinkering by the neighbors. China somehow thinks that there's some clever solution here, that if the military just holds an election in 35% of the territory, like a magic wand, it stabilizes the situation. India's response has been even worse. It seems to be, first, let's sell, weapons to the junta so they can win, because then they'll thank us. And then when that's not going to work, let's just build a border fence and pretend that we can ignore the entire issue. Am I being unkind, ungenerous to the neighbors?
For the most part, I'd agree with you, but I don't think I would agree with you entirely. First of all, I think in terms of just basic interests and alignment of political capital, China's interest in Myanmar is multi-layered and strategic. It cannot be even remotely compared with India's interest in Myanmar, which is minimal at best and more reactive than it is proactive. China has always looked at Myanmar as a long-term strategic play as it relates to their broader One Belt, One Road policy, right? And their baseline, I think, has always been very clear, very simple. They just want continued stability and continued prosperity of their interests over everyone else in Myanmar. That's the big idea, right? When the things that politically happen around it, or militarily for that matter, no longer aligns or support that interest, they may make shifts and changes and adjustments accordingly. But the question really is, if not elections, right? And let's flip the frame here a little bit and think from where the Chinese are sitting. What's the alternative? Are they realistically going to support regime change? inside the Myanmar military, thereby setting the regime can be changed. And then who's to say that some other 2-star, 3-star general won't do the same to the one that comes after him, right? Do they want to open that Pandora's box? I think, at least for now, it was clear from the Wang Yi meetings that they have no alternative but to be okay with the current guy continuing to lead the military. That's one. And two, when they look at outside alternatives away from the military, again, the Chinese Communist Party's motto itself is power comes from the barrel of a gun. I mean, this is the premise in which they're looking at this whole thing. So you look at it and you think about it and you see, well, if not them, who else has the capacity and capability to offer any central governance role? And I think they did the evaluation. They did an extensive evaluation and dismissed all other alternatives as not serious or institutionally sound enough to replace the military. And then, of course, you have the various ethnic organizations, armed or otherwise, right, with their varying and divergent interests. So the pragmatic approach for them was, all right, well, let's get every ERO, EAO that touches our border, let's get that rhetoric or policy alignment intact, which is what you will see them playing through the UWSA in some of the recent operations. But once you get that border part taken care of, all right, let's take the next step about influencing how things happen or turn out politically in country.
Just to follow down, all right, so I accept the premise that China, or at least officials in Beijing, have assessed that supporting the military junta is their best option among bad options. That's their assessment. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. In the case of Operation 1027, clearly China gave a blessing to Operation 1027 and then said, okay, time to stop fighting. And then the TNLA and the AA in particular didn't stop fighting. China said, wait, no, you were supposed to stop when we said stop. And here we are almost a year later. They've brokered, 3 broken ceasefires. They clearly can't actually control, even the UWSA, they can't wholly control. And they certainly can't control the others of the Three Brotherhood Alliance. So even if their primary goal is to stabilize the border and then move on to stabilizing the country, it seems like China has vastly overestimated its ability to stabilize the border.
Yes, but you have to understand too, Greg, that those involvement and those announcements are mostly on paper and through diplomatic channels. China can and will, if they wish to, if there is real political will to, throw out the stick, right? They have that in their hand. They haven't used that. And they know that the language that they need to speak to get some of those other EROs to get in line is, well, a language everybody understands. Sheer force. When that happens, when interest, and I'm not saying that it will happen, right? So I should say if and when that happens, we'll have to see if that actually delivers the results they want delivered. Because so far, in terms of real stick, real hard power politics, China hasn't really played it, right? It's just a few statements and some diplomats playing peacemaker, which to the EAOs too is a wink and a nod as far as they're concerned.
So, Jack, I'm curious here. We've talked about China. We've talked briefly about India. Let's talk about Washington, right? I mean, how should Washington be responding to these most recent developments? What more should we be doing? What are we not doing enough of? Where would you say the issue is on the agenda right now in terms of diplomatic engagement otherwise?
Yes, I think on the broad sphere of all U.S. foreign policy priorities, Myanmar is not on top of the list. I think that's a fact at this point that everybody knows. That said, U.S. interest in Myanmar has been consistent and been focused around mostly the human rights and democracy. I think U.S. actions, both from the administration and Congress, have so far been consistent, though largely symbolic in nature, right? So, you have the Burma Act that passed. You have the creation of the Congressional Burma Caucus. You have now the Brave Burma Act that is being in its draft form in the House of Representatives. But if we have to talk tangibles in policy, let's talk tangibles. The first and biggest tool in the toolkit is sanctions. Sanctions is the name of the game, right? Sanctions that so far the Biden administration had described as, and I quote, targeted and coordinated. Targeted in the sense of keeping it towards the perpetrators within the Myanmar military that are responsible for this, and coordinated in the sense of getting partners in like-minded Western nations aligned so that collectively they can make these sanctions more effective. And so far, I think they have generated the intended effect, right? The broader economy, foreign transactions. I mean, you look at the state of the economy, it's in complete and total peril. So while we applaud and appreciate the US's efforts to keep things shielded from impacting the broader general populace, the fact of the matter is it still does have negative unintended consequences. But such is the case with sanctions everywhere. So I won't single that out as a Myanmar unique case, right? The second is the aid and support through Burma Act and other efforts of supporting the capacity building programs and trainings to pro-democracy aligned forces, which initially has been really limited to the civil society organizations and representatives of the national unity government. But now we're starting to see that expand and include conversations with ethnic armed actors as well, which means a stepping up in terms of broader pro-democracy engagement. And of course, there is, as I said, a subsect to my earlier portion of symbolic constant meetings with those in the pro-democracy movement and senior levels of the US government. That's what tangible is there, right? One thing which is hard for us to speak on because it has never been confirmed, where based on these ARD and Myanmar Now articles that came out recently, as you all may have read, about the US government's secret engagements with the Myanmar junta in Hanoi. And because I have not seen, and if I missed it, I apologize, anything from the State Department, whether that in fact happened or not, it is hard for me to comment. But if you ask me, is it good? Because if we're playing a game of whataboutism, is that good if it did happen? Then I can say, well, like a newly minted think tanker, that depends. It depends on what they are trying to achieve. Because this is also not the first case of communication between the US government representatives and representatives of the Myanmar junta. After all, we have an entire US embassy there. Of course, in order for an embassy to remain functioning, there has to be some degree of interaction, at the very least at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs level. That much is already been understood. But if there are, in fact, and again, that's a big if there are, in fact, meetings happening between the USG decision makers and active Myanmar military with real decision-making power, the question is, what is the intended outcome of such an initiative, right? If it is to achieve something tangible like peace or brokering talks and finding a way to end this conflict and the senseless killing, I think no one would disagree with me in saying that is great. And that is something that, we should rally behind and support. But if it is not well planned, nor thought out, and just a meeting for the sake of having a meeting, then it could backfire if the junta uses it as a propaganda piece to say the US is legitimizing them, right? But because I don't know if those actually did happen, so I can't ask what the intention behind it is, it's hard for me to predict.
We know one meeting happened in Hanoi, and I'm led to understand it was a waste of time. Led to understand by the U.S. side that it was...
Was it confirmed by the State Department? Because I didn't see that.
The State Department didn't confirm it. It was widely reported and nobody denied that the State Department met with a Myanmar naval officer in Hanoi. But I think the more important meeting, as you already indicated, was the first publicly acknowledged senior level meetings with representatives of ethnic resistance organizations this summer. It was not the first time that State Department had engaged with them, but to have the publicly reported meetings with representatives of Karen, Karenni, Kachin, and we have Chin participants suggests to me that the administration is finally trying to operationalize one of the key components of the Burma Act, which was just engage with the National Unity Government or the successors of the National League of Democracy, but engage with all resistance actors within Myanmar. And a lot of those remain very difficult. It's very difficult to engage, for instance, with the WA or the Arakan Army, given reports coming out about crimes against Rohingya. But I think they're trying to get creative.
If I may deliver one draw from my earlier assessment, it is just drive this one message home, is that every time the U.S. makes any move on Myanmar, rest assured the Chinese are monitoring it closely, and the Chinese will double, nay, triple down in order to balance it out with their own interests. A Chinese diplomat friend of mine recently told me that President Xi Jinping has broader policy, the anti-drug policy. And he said, which extends beyond China, it's a global anti-drug policy. And he said, given the rampant nature of drug production and trade in Mexico, if China started looking at supporting militarily or otherwise forces inside Mexico, how would the U.S. feel? Well, that's how we feel when the U.S. gets involved in Myanmar. That's their prerogative. I don't agree with it, but it does help give me some perspective. When the U.S. passed the Burma Act, the Chinese responded. They made a move. They engaged with the military. And then when, of course, these rumors of a secret meeting or engagement with the military came out, they responded. So what the U.S. does has bigger repercussive consequences in the broader region, and of course, how China manages its Myanmar policy moving forward.
That's certainly true. And I think the U.S. government, exquisitely aware of the China component of this, although it doesn't want its Myanmar policy to be a China policy, right? It does not want to turn engagement on the Myanmar crisis strictly into another front in U.S.-China competition. I mean, what I take heart from is, one, the U.S. has been relatively ineffective in its engagement, although I would argue that certain things like sanctions on jet fuel have had a measurable impact in supporting battlefield victories for resistance actors. But overall, it has had very limited leverage. That said, China has been somewhere between ineffective and counterproductive for its own interests over the last 3 years. When we look at consistent Gallup polling, for instance, it's clear that the Myanmar public is probably the second most pro-U.S. and anti-China public in all of Southeast Asia. China is blamed now by both sides of the conflict for its role in Myanmar. I don't see a sustainable future in which China's interests are accomplished by its current activities in Myanmar. I mean, in the short term, yeah, they can try to play chess master and, tinker with EROs on the northern border and prop up a dying junta. But I really think they're missing the broader fact, which is you've got tens of millions of people who are deeply antipathetic toward China. And that's going to remain a long-term drag on China's interest and influence in the region. I want to ask one thing, because we've gotten this far into a conversation about Myanmar, 3+ years into the war, and we haven't even talked about the National Unity Government. By the fact that we felt that this didn't need to be brought up, what does that tell us about the role of the NUG in the fight today?
Well, way to put me in a tough spot here, Greg.
You can push back. You can say that I should have asked you about it earlier.
Let me finish and concur with you on your thought regarding China. I couldn't agree more. The China play, if we want to call it that, right now, while it may seem to work now, is definitely not long-term sustainable, and they are not winning hearts and minds in Myanmar or across the region, and that's going to bite them in the neck sometime down the line. It's not going to be today, it's not going to be tomorrow, but it is definitely not sustainable. That's the end of my assessment on and conversation on China. To your question about the National Unity Government, I think for lack of a better alternative, what can we say, right? Who can we look to that aligns most with the values of democracy and human rights in this country. There are not a lot of players. And yes, if you criticize their capability and their capacity to deliver, I'll accept it. And I think it is intellectually and scholastically honest to acknowledge that there are so many capacity and capability challenges. But the question is really, what else do you have? You have the ethnic groups, the ethnic armed groups, or unarmed, some going for their regional sovereignty, some going for their resources, some playing both sides. I mean, there's so many varying interests at play here that there can't be one consolidated entity that can say, well, we represent the voice of the Myanmar people. But even then, right, even for the NUG, that's the big question that they struggle with constantly, is that do they speak for the right of the Myanmar people or for the Bama majority only, right? And limited participation from ethnic groups, because the Rakhine might say, well, actually, the AA speaks for us, the NUG doesn't. The KIA similarly, so on and so forth. So that's a lot of factors to consider here. But right now, for lack of a better alternative, there is no other entity. So we either work with what we've got and help with the building of that capacity, or we don't work on it at all.
That was cogent. Far more cogent than my question was. Thank you. All right. We're going to have to end there. We have a body of work on U.S. policy in Myanmar coming up that Jack will be helping with. So stay tuned to CSIS over the next months and year or so. But for now, Jack, thanks so much for joining us. Andreyka, thank you for coming back. And all of you, thanks for listening. Alina and I will be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Greg, thank you for having me on and for your forbearance with my long-windedness. Appreciate you. Take care.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at scaradio@csis.org, and we'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe. Give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our host today was Greg Poling. My name is Lauren Mai.
And I'm Japhet Kitson.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.